In this lesson, we take a look at Arnold Procedural, which allows you to postpone the loading of geometry data until render time and when array hits the bounding box of it. And this makes the scene and the viewport light and navigable. So here's the scene we are going to be working with. I have this dragon model from Cinema 4D's Common browser, and it is about 550,000 polys. If I right click on it and choose object information, you can see the exact number of polys and vertices of this particular object. Now, working with one of these dragons would be easy. I can simply navigate in my viewport without any problems. But imagine if I wanted to have like 100 of these guys in my scene. That's about 50 million polys. And I assure you, navigating in such a scene will be a nightmare. But using Arnold Procedural, we can have as many of these dragons as we want without having any viewport issues. Now the process is like this. First, you need to export your model to .as file, .ass file, which is Arnold's scene source file. You do that using as export from the C4D2A plugin menu, and then load that exported file into the scene using Arnold Procedural in the C4D2A plugin menu again. Now let's select the dragon and click on as export from the plugin menu. First, define where you want to save this file. By default, it will be saved in the text folder of your Cinema 4D project. Let's click on this button and rename the file to dragon. Now, if you have a very huge file, you can use gzip compression and save the geometry or scene to the gzip compressed files. Use binary encoding specifies whether binary encoding is used to compress large arrays or not. You have expand procedural. If you want to get all the nodes when exporting as files, you need to make sure this option is enabled. Then using export objects menu, you can define whether to export all the objects in the scene, only the selected ones in one as files, or only the selected objects to separate as files using selected individually option. Let's change this to selected for now. And down here you can define which types of nodes you want to include in your as export: cameras, lights, shaders, etc. You can define the frame range, which currently uses render settings defined frame range, but you can change it to current frame or change it to custom and define your own frame range. The render setting is currently set to current frame, so we are not going to be exporting any sequence. And finally, click on export for procedural, and it takes a few moments to export the file, and we're done. Now, to load that as file that I just exported, I need to create an Arnold Procedural. So let's create it from C4D2A plugin menu. The first thing you need to do is to load that as file you just exported, and this is our dragon as file, which is about 63 megabytes. Let's open it. As you can see, we have this bounding box in our scene. I'll just hide the main dragon model, and if I run my IPR, you can see we have our dragon model in that as file we imported. Let me stop the IPR for now. If you load a sequence of frames, you would get these animation controls like start and end frames. We have display bounding box. If I change display mode to something like point cloud, we still see the bounding box, and if I disable a display bounding box, the bounding box is gone. Let's enable it again. Using object display mode, you can control procedural display mode. So we have none, bounding box, point cloud, wireframe, polywire, shaded polywire, and shaded. And the most efficient one is obviously the bounding box. Let's set it to bounding box for now. We have create object. If you enable it, procedural works like a normal polygonal object, and while enabled, if you press C to convert this geometry, you would get a normal polygonal object in your object manager. Let's disable this option for now. Then we have this override tab, which lets you define how the rendering options like cast, shadow, primary visibility, and stuff like that work with the procedural. You have two options, mute and off, for each rendering option. Mute uses the value set within the procedural file, and off disable that option. In the Assets tab, you can define different assets like textures, for example. So if the exported as file had a texture and you loaded that file using Arnold Procedural, you need to define that texture path here in the Assets tab so C4D2A can use it. Then we have this ASTOC menu. The ASTOC file is a cache which describes the bounding box of the procedural. It allows an optimization of the scene since the plugin does not have to read the referenced AS file to detect the bounds. The ASTOC file can be exported via the AS export dialog. When you actually export your AS file using the AS export menu, an ASTOC file also will be saved alongside it that can be used. However, there are cases when no ASTOC files exist. For example, when the AS files are coming from a different source, like RealFlow or another software. If C42A cannot detect the bounding box, if no ASTOC file is given and the bounds could not be read from the reference AS file, then a default bounding box is used, which has a size of 1000 units, and a warning is displayed in the log. The ASTOC tab of the procedural offers a user-friendly cache generation for this case. So you can click on this generate button and create a cache. Now let's put this into practice and see how good it works. Let me apply this standard surface shader with SSS qualities to this dragon model. And let's create a cloner from MoGraph menu and change the mode to grid array. Decrease the count on Y to 1, and for X and Z, let's set them to 6 and 6. So we are going to have about 36 dragons, about 20 million polys in our scene. Now let's set this Arnold Procedural as the child of this cloner and wait a moment. As you can see, we have a very snappy viewport. If I run my IPR, you can see how quick the feedback is, and we are rendering 20 million polys without affecting memory or CPU performances at all. Look, as I'm moving around my scene, how quick IPR responds, and it would be much quicker for you because I'm having a few heavy software running in the background and they affect the performance. Okay, so that's about Arnold Procedurals, and I will see you in the next lesson.